This session is titled Resilience to Resurgence, Indian Institutions in an Era of Global Competition. As the National Education Policy 2020, or what we've been calling NEP 2020, opens doors for foreign universities to enter India, this session examines how local institutions are navigating this new era of global competition. Leading vice chancellors and experts will analyze the challenges national HEIs face in coping with the competition posed by emerging education hubs like Gift City and Edu City. The discussion will highlight the strategic shift of Indian institutions as they move from maintaining resilience to leading a resurgence by establishing their own campuses abroad. I would like to invite all the speakers for this session on stage, please. The speakers for this session are Dr. Ramakrishnan Raman, Vice Chancellor, Symbiosis International University; Dr. P.G. Babu, Vice Chancellor, Vidyashilp University, Bangalore, India; Dr. Ashwin Fernandes, Chair and Vice President, Strategic and International Engagement, QS India; Professor Bhavna Kumar, Director, TNE and Institutional Partnerships, Acumen India. May I please request you to take the stage? This session will be moderated by Dr. Anupama Kotur. Dr. Anupama is currently serving as the head of International Academic Programs and Symbiosis Center for India-Australia Studies, SCIAS. Dr. Anupama has extensive experience in building and sustaining collaborations with universities worldwide. Her work centers on shaping SIU's global strategies, strengthening international networks, and enhancing global visibility. Known for her strategic vision and execution, she has significantly contributed to creating impactful, sustainable educational frameworks that foster cross-cultural engagement and elevate institutional presence in the global higher education landscape. Her research interests are in the areas of, I bet nobody's going to be able to guess this one. I repeat the sentence again. Her research interests are in the areas of wine tourism and luxury tourism marketing, and she's an active reviewer for a number of international journals of repute. The Emerald Handbook of Luxury Management for Hospitality and Tourism is her latest notable publication. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Damini. A very warm welcome to everyone here, and we are about to begin the 5th session of the 2026 edition of the Internationalization of Higher Education Conference. In fact, this session could not have happened at a more opportune time because we just heard from one of the architects of the transnational education policy about why there was a necessity to do what we are doing. And this important session is to understand how Indian universities and institutions are preparing themselves from resilience to resurgence. With the implementation of a very progressive and forward-looking national education policy in 2020, India is not only trying to reimagine its academic architecture, but we are also opening our doors for foreign universities in very unprecedented ways. The entry of foreign universities, 20 of them we just heard, and 5 of whom are already operational, and the setting up of hubs such as Gift City and Edu City, and of course the growing fluidity of cross-border collaborations is fundamentally reshaping the competitive landscape of Indian higher education. We really, as a country, are living in a very pivotal moment where we are witnessing this amazing evolution of the Indian higher education. For decades, Indian institutions and universities have been resilient in the sense that we've been navigating through regulatory restrictions, difficulties in terms of scaling, accessibility, and such others. But what's essentially different now is the opportunity and the need, the necessity to move beyond resilience and progress towards resurgence, to compete, to collaborate, and lead on a global stage. This transition, essentially brings forward several questions. That how prepared are Indian institutions and universities to compete with well-endowed and well-capitalized foreign players? will this new ecosystem really intensify the equality, or will it pave way for some amazing innovations that we will see in the future? And perhaps most importantly, how can Indian universities define their own distinctive global identity rather than responding to the external pressure? Among the audience, I see several academic leaders, partners, senior scholars, and colleagues with whom I have had the privilege of having these conversations. And it is from those very engaging and meaningful conversations that I draw inspiration to the questions that I am about to pose to a very eminent panel that I have here with me. Well, as a moderator, I am acutely aware of the fact that none of the panel members that I have with me here need an introduction, because all of them are stalwarts in their own space. And all of them come with such distinguished reputation that no introduction is needed. But as a moderator, I must do my duty. I begin with welcoming our first panelist for the day, Professor P. Guruswamy Babu, who is a distinguished academic leader and a visionary who leads the Bangalore-based Vidyashilp University as its Vice Chancellor. Prior to this, Professor Babu was associated with Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, Mumbai, Madras Institute of Development Studies. Professor Babu has held the prestigious Adam Smith Chair Professorship in Philosophy and Economics at the University of Bayreuth, Germany, has immense experience spearheading the Erasmus Plus European Masters and Doctoral Program in Law and Economics. Professor Babu enjoys reading short stories and non-fiction essays that focus on everyday people, and misses walking at the periphery of Arey Milk Colony in Mumbai and spotting leopards during the monsoons. Welcome to you, Professor Babu. Our next panelist hardly needs an introduction. Dr. Ashwin Fernandes is the chair of QS India and Vice President of Strategic and International Engagement. In his role, he is responsible for advancing QS's strategic engagement globally, with a particular focus on strengthening QS's leadership in India and deepening collaboration across key international markets. Dr. Ashwin championed the need for an independent ranking framework in the Arab region, and hence was instrumental in developing the QS Arab Region University Ranking. He also founded India's first nationwide private sector evaluation framework that all of us now know as QS iGauge. Welcome to you, Dr. Ashwin. Our next panelist, Dr. Bhavna Kumar, a good friend, is the director of T&E and institutional partnerships at Acumen, which is a part of Saram S4 Group. Dr. Bhavna has over 3 decades of work experience, having been closely associated with the growth and development of international business schools and foreign campuses, and as well as internationalization of leading institutions, including the establishment of global campuses, deploying her extensive experience in quality assurance and enhancement. Dr. Bhavna enjoys walking, reading, and cycling, and hopes to see good cycle tracks in India someday where everyone can work, cycle to work and elsewhere. Welcome, Dr. Bhavna. Our last panelist of the day, of this session, needs absolutely no introduction. Our own Vice Chancellor, Dr. Ramakrishnan Raman, Vice Chancellor of Symbiosis International University. And he has served Symbiosis for over a decade now, in different capacities, of course, including the professor and director of Symbiosis Center for Information Technology and Symbiosis Institute of Business Management, Pune. He's also held other positions such as the Dean of Faculty of Management, as well as the Director of Strategy and Development. He's a prolific researcher, of course, something that all of us are aware of, and his areas of expertise are information system, IT strategy, entrepreneurship, AI, and big data. Dr. Raman's commendable contribution have earned him recognition in both administrative and research spheres, and he has served as a distinguished member of various prestigious committees by the university's Grants Commission. Dr. Raman is a technology enthusiast and enjoys reading about emerging innovations, artificial intelligence, and the future of digital transformation. Well, I have divided the questions that I'm about to pose in 3 categories, just for the sake of convenience and continuity of thought. And the first set of questions that I'm about to pose relate to the strategic and competitive implications of the setting up of IBCs in India. My first question is to you, Professor Babu. How do you see the development of GIFT City and Edu City reshaping the geography of higher education in India? The city of Bangalore, for instance, will very soon open the doors for IBCs. And do you think that these hubs could create an uneven competition across regions?
I don't see the GIFT City, the Ed City, and the IBCs in Bangalore. They're not really homogeneous. Like, they differ quite a bit. GIFT City, for example, if you see, there are some of the universities which are the curriculum is linked to the industries which are there in the GIFT City. Like, if you look at IBCs, for example, in Bangalore, I'm not sure whether they will have the same kind of autonomy which the GIFT City universities will have. So they differ quite a bit among themselves. It's not like one homogeneous picture. So we don't know like how it would, given that kind of a thing. They also, you remember, you need to worry about the Indian environment. Take GIFT City, for example. Do you get a university feel, like, because they still don't have hostels and all that inside. So it's not really a city university like many of the European universities are, where it is like merged with the city. And they are not campus universities like the way it is in India and the US and so on, other places, like huge campuses with 100 acres, 200 acre campuses and so on and so forth. So you're not going to get that kind of a university feel in either any of these things, like how they will shape up in the future, we are yet to see. But right now, that's like the kind of picture you get. So unevenness is unlikely, Anupama. Like, I think I don't see it happening. And there also, if you remember, we have a rich knowledge and history. Like, we have always lived in this dual economy framework, like it be dual labor markets or our academic institutions. They were always in these 2 tiers, right? So we had to begin with, you had the best of the IITs and IIMs, the 5 of them and the 3 IIMs you have. And then you democratized it over the time period. So like, if you think we didn't have that kind of unevenness when the original 5 and 3 were there, and to correct it, like if you think like we have kind of increased the number of IITs, IIMs, and so on and so forth, and converted the RECs into a National Institute of Technologies and so on and so forth. So then I think like we already know how to handle, even if there is an unevenness which is brought about by the presence of the foreign universities here in these special campuses, still you can handle it. So we have the knowledge with us, the experience with us, so we should be able to better handle that. So that's the way I would think about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Babu. My next question goes out to Dr. Raman. How are Indian institutions repositioning themselves strategically in response to this development? For instance, Symbiosis has set up its first campus in Dubai. What does this strategic move really mean, and what does it signify for universities such as ours?
Yeah, thank you. So as far as Symbiosis moving outside India, the reasons are 2. One, we expanded within India before we went outside India. There are universities which went outside India before having their expansion in India. There are a few of them, but some of them did expand within India. So first thing was establishing a campus in Bangalore. Then we went with Noida, Hyderabad, Nagpur, Nasik. And the reason to go out is to give opportunities to students. We have a lot of students from the Middle East and Africa who do come here. When they come here, they have their problems. When students come into India, one is the institution, the other is the ecosystem. So it's not just the institution or the degree which is important, but it is also the ecosystem that is important when any student chooses an institution for their degree. Let us take a classic example. We have this campus, 400-acre campus. If you look at the infrastructure that is here, the roads, everything is fabulous. But each one who came here to this campus had to cross that 1.5 kilometer where the work is going on, which started about 6-7 months back. And I expect that will take another 7-8 months, optimistically, for that work to complete. Now, this is reality and this is India, right? So when things like this happen, when foreign universities are also setting up campus here, it is not just about that campus or the degree, it is the entire ecosystem which has to support for students to choose that institution. So when we went outside, the nearest was Dubai, and we went with a CAA accreditation with a goal to ensure that, of course, there is an Indian diaspora who will choose us because we are a brand that is known, but we also have a lot of students from Middle East and from Africa who then choose that campus. In fact, that's happening now. So when we cannot go ahead and solve the macro level issues which are not in our control, we'll have to be present in a place where these are solved. And that one destination is Dubai. And we went there with a CAA accreditation, which many universities didn't, so that from day one, when a student completes his or her degree, also gets an opportunity to work with the government there, which is a mandate, right? So these are a couple of reasons for expansion, having our presence here, unable to meet the demands of students, 150,000 students applying, unable to give a chance for all of them to pursue their education, and a large number of students outside India who are also applying, whom we are not able to take in all our institutions, are two main reasons for us to go out. So these are the strategic reasons.
If I could stay on that thought of repositioning and slightly shift the gear towards being more competitive. Dr. Ashwin, my question to you is, you've been a higher education strategist. In your opinion, how can Indian universities address the competitive imbalance that might emerge? If branch campuses operate under the global ranking halo, which obviously they would be, are we really creating a level playing field here for Indian universities to compete against very highly ranked international universities?
So thank you so much, Dr. Anupama, for that. And I think this is a pertinent discussion to the current landscape, what we are looking at. And before I answer your question, I would like to ask the room this question. Which India are we talking about when we're looking at this competitive landscape? When we're comparing IBCs to domestic institutions. In my view, I think there are two Indias we are comparing this against. One is an India that is run by the public universities, where access to the common people, getting our GER from 30% to 50% is a target. And I think that public institution landscape is highly insulated from this halo or from the competition which the IBCs bring. Okay, I think University of Delhi, one of the colleges offers you a BA or a BCom degree where the tuition fee is, 500 rupees, and then you add on some other fees. And when we're talking to IBCs, the fee structure is completely different. So the IBCs are not targeting what our institutions, which is the University of Delhi or University of Mumbai or Savitribai Phule Pune University, are offering. The students they are targeting are perhaps from Meerut or from Hubli or from Belgaum, from places which are first generation learners. So, and of course, they probably are not the target. The second India we're talking about are run by the private institutions. And this is where instead of looking at the competitive landscape, I think it has also given rise to understanding in the private sector. And this is with all due respect to the private institutions here today and to the friends I have created. people are starting to look at what is that differentiating factor which the foreign IBCs are bringing to India. They are coming with decades of experience. You know, Southampton has got 170 years of legacy behind them. They have got a QAA accreditation, which is globally recognized. They bring together a cohort of employers which are looking for this. So I think when we look at the private institutions, I feel they are the ones who probably have started to realize that, and institutions like Symbiosis or many other private institutions as well have realized it long before. And as Dr. Raman mentioned, they have not waited for the national education policy to define internationalization, but gone out themselves much before the NEP and created that niche for them, not just in India, but also outside India. Now, that's the context setting. But beyond that, let's look at what the IBCs bring in. Definitely, they bring in a halo. But it is a borrowed halo which the branch campuses are bringing in. Now, we'll have to wait and watch how this borrowed halo actually impacts their credibility in India. They have just started. I think they are, and there's a report which Deloitte released, and Deloitte and QS worked on it. We released it in February, which looked at over the next 15 years, India would save $115 billion as outflow of foreign reserves. So there are some aspects which the IBCs will bring in. So I feel the halo is definitely one of them which they are benefited with, but they also bring with them certain know-how, curriculum, the working of the quality landscapes. And as they progress in India, I think our Indian institutions also need to game up their game to be able to compete, to offer value, to offer what they are going to provide. And when we compare the fees, I think there's an asymmetry of fees being offered. And a University of Southampton or Deakin University, when they're offering a degree, they're not offering a India degree, they're offering a foreign degree. So when a global employer in Singapore or in London or in Dubai is looking at them, they are looking at a graduate from a university from either UK or Australia. So we will need to also start to use benchmarks. And while India, for a while now, I've been working with Indian institution for 14 years, it has been the last 7 years that the focus on international benchmarks has risen. And we'll need to start comparing these institutions using the same metric. Now, we can, of course, say we are NAC A++ accredited, and you're coming with a QAA accreditation, the foreign branch campuses. But let's look at the equivalency of that. So probably the use of international benchmarks like rankings as the end goal of what you're doing is what they should be looking at.
Professor Raman as well as Professor Babu indicated that it's not just the curricular innovativeness, but then also the entire ecosystem that needs to be there to support. And of course, the IBCs that are coming in are better ranked. And then, of course, we will now have to understand this from the student's perspective. Ultimately, all of these offerings are for the students. And I would now, ask Dr. Bhavna to, shed some light on how might these developments really might be influencing the student decision making, especially for those who probably were looking at, who were probably aspiring to study abroad. Do you think that could we probably see a significant shift, if not a reversal, in the outbound mobility of students?
I feel that definitely it's not going to be a reversal. As with anything that is a catalyst, this is a change, it's a trigger, and it will reshape. When I was passing out of school in 89, it was undergraduate has to be in India. Delhi University seats were available. And the aspiration was to go in for an IIT or that time Delhi College, etc. Post-graduation, I'm a graduate engineer. Most of 99% of my class were looking at post-graduation abroad. Earlier generation was PhD abroad. moving a few years down the line, it changed that aspiration to even undergrad abroad, because again, the quantum to the quality seats that are available, Delhi University, I'm talking about Delhi because I'm from Delhi, has no longer become as accessible. It's highly competitive. You have to store maybe 100% to get there. And so from the very beginning, the outbound mobility question has been, there's no point in me being even targeting that segment. And hence the parents and the peers who can afford have been looking at that option. The reshaping is becoming more strategic with the advent of, I think, international branch campuses, and besides that also privatization. I have been in the sector as a student, as a parent of 2 children who are in Indian universities. And in 2020, when my own daughter was graduating from school, COVID year, she said, I don't want to go abroad. As a parent, I could be the one to afford it. But the question was not about affordability, nor even about quality. It was about, does she have a choice of the 2 subjects she wanted to study? It was bio and maths. And I said, Delhi University, you could get through. She says, yes, I can, but Delhi University will give me a botany and a zoology. I don't want to do that. Now, I want to do a bio and maths. And in our country, it has been, for me, it was, science was default because I was a good student. Nobody asked me, do I want to do a bio and a maths? So the reshaping of the choices which are becoming, and the opening of this sector to, yes, you can have a student do a economics with the maths, with the bio. And had it not been from a private university, Ashoka, which was offering this option, so it's not only about a foreign university coming in, it's also about how we are evolving our own universities and the option to a student who wants to be a strategic choice rather than just a choice, do I want to go abroad? I think the aspiration to learn and get an exposure exists. That exposure could be as much as me coming from Delhi to Pune, or a Pune to a Bangalore. Mr. Armstrong was talking about, go and see the IIT Madras Research Park. I have worked with IIT Madras on a Niti Aayog report of internationalization of higher education for 2 years, and I've been in the park, and it's absolutely aspirational. Yes, if you spend 6 months there, your outbound mobility aspirations are possibly covered a lot more here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhavna, for that. For the next round of questions, I would like to slightly shift the focus to address some of the operational challenges, such as academic sovereignty, what could be the implications on the partnerships, and also some of the other strategic challenges that we face today. Dr. P.G. Babu, if I could come to you again. As foreign universities bring their curricula, pedagogy, and research priorities in India, how do we ensure that academic sovereignty and preservation of Indian knowledge systems is maintained? Do you think that we face the risk of an intellectual harmonization?
Homogenization is a possibility. For example, when I think of ancient Indian mathematics, when we think about Indian knowledge systems, it was computational, right? So that was the emphasis was on that. And then I think we lost it, or rather we let go of it, and we focused more on axiomatization and all those other kind of things, right? So which came from the Western kind of mathematics. Had we kept on that computational tradition, probably by now, like we'll be ahead in the AI race. But be that as it may, but like it differs also across subjects. Let me hasten to add that, like, for example, homogenization is a must in certain disciplines, right? Or certain parts of the discipline, any subject. If I take the example of economics, for example, microeconomics cannot be taught differently in India versus US or in Germany, right? It has to be the same. However, any macroeconomic ideas can differ from country to country. So as I'm pointing out, like every discipline, even within the discipline, there are certain parts which will be homogeneous by the way the subject is developed and the core of it, and certain parts where it can be heterogeneous. And the same kind of thing will continue, like if you think of law, for example. We have common law countries like India, US, and UK, and we also have civil law countries like Germany, France, and so on and so forth, right? So there will be those differences between common law and civil law practices if you're studying law, for example. If you're an anthropologist, again, like, these things would change. Like, where you are. As an anthropologist, for example, I see a ritual in a third world country, and I think it is barbaric. But it may not be barbaric. Actually, it is like, it is a kind of exchange between the fishermen and the inlanders, the vegetables and so on and so forth. And it is a kind of a record-keeping device. So so those kind of, both homogeneity and heterogeneity would exist. And foreign universities which are setting campuses here also cannot be oblivious to the Indian situation, like Indian traditions and so on and so forth, knowledge systems. So at some point, I think they have to kind of get into that, get into the skin of that. So because they are setting the campuses here and they are catering to our student clientele, and invariably, I think this will certainly play a role. That's the way I would see this.
And that's an interesting observation, Professor Babu. There should be, or we will perhaps see a convergence. Dr. Bhavna, if I could turn to you to, reflect on what could these developments mean for the partnerships that we have as universities with some of the IBCs that have come in. In your understanding, do you think that, programs such as dual degrees and joint degrees and pathway programs, there are existing partnerships between several Indian universities and the IBCs that have come in. What do you think shall be the models of such partnerships going forward? Do you think that there still is a future for the programs that we've launched, such as dual degrees and joint degrees? Or there could be a newer or an innovative model that we'll probably see?
My favorite question, because I have been executing these since 2003, and I remember in 2003 when it was not even a private university, Act had not been announced, and I was leading a program where it was actually 1 year here and 1 year in UK, and students were going abroad, and that partnership was very much in terms of mobility with credit transfers at that point of time. To a few years down the line, when I just saw people were almost like collecting and hanging MOUs on their walls, and it was more about how many partnerships can you showcase on your brochure or on your website, and how many are you actually implementing. It was, yes, we shake hands, two vice chancellors meet on a plane, and they shake hands, and yes, we must partner, but then how does it percolate down? Is there even the system in place to be able to do that? That profoundness in terms of the structural change is something that I have been very happy to witness over the last few years, and more beyond, because we have about over 58,000 institutions in our country. The interest of even beyond the ones which have been very active in the system, like Symbiosis, has been phenomenal. Ever since National Education Policy and the movement of these campuses, people have been, I've come across so many people, and I reach out to so many people, and so many people talk to me, and everybody is intent, how can we actually form some kind of a meaningful partnership? And that co-ownership of how the dual degrees and joint degrees have become more embedded is a very, very heartening change. But that said, the risks are there as well. I see Devesh, I bumped into him, and I was responsible for a 3-year 1+2 model at one of the universities with Birmingham. And now UK is a 3-year engineering degree. In India, we have a 4-year engineering degree. Now, does the Indian university change a 4-year engineering degree and make its own 3-year engineering degree? It was a very big structural challenge. If you're looking at a 2+2, so do you do 2 years here and the person gets entry into the 2nd year of Birmingham? So we did successfully send some students through a 1+2, but then that means dismantling the entire structure, or asking somebody, you should change 4-year engineering to a 3-year engineering here. And even if, okay, one university does that, is that a deeper, meaningful collaboration between just two countries, or are you looking at then expanding that across more countries? A semester abroad program could not only be just a pathway, you have to also accept those credits. Now, some of the universities that I have been working with, they say, very good, top 20 university, credits are all very well earned, but this is not the course that my student was supposed to study in the semester. If you're comparing an apple to an apple, you will never be able to reverse manage the credit. So the responsibility of Indian institutions, and some of them have been doing it very meaningfully into the deeper partnerships that will enable these collaborations and show us actually better pathways, better dual degree programs. But that has to be to the core. It has to be embedded. Internationalization is not the responsibility of one person or one department. It has to be lived by every person, every department, every academician, and the responsibility to be able to look at that concept being included in your entire university what will make it meaningful.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna. Dr. Ashwin, To what extent is a deeper alignment needed between domestic accreditation frameworks and global quality assurance systems? From a strategic standpoint, what risks might emerge for Indian institutions and students if such an alignment does not keep pace with the international developments?
So I have to say that all views expressed are purely personal and does not reflect QS. So as a disclaimer first, because I don't want to be misquoted as a QS viewpoint on this. So let's go to 1st of February 2025. Do you know what happened on 1st of February 2025? The chairman and 6 members of a NAC inspection committee were allegedly involved in some kind of maneuvering of scores. Now, that's a backdrop against where we are asking Indian institutions to compete with the global counterparts which are coming to India, who are coming in either with a QAA accreditation or a TEXA equivalency or a US regional accreditation or several other renowned accreditations which have stood the test of time. And I believe there are a couple of things we need to look at when we're looking at the accreditation equivalency, or how do you compare, and what I get from your question is, how do we compare our Indian accreditation with global accreditations? So the first part is that there is definitely a gap in the actual accreditation in the country. I think 30% of the institutions still are not accredited, so 690 universities and about 30,000 colleges yet are to be accredited. So that's the first thing. We really need to move the accreditation needle to evaluate more institutions. The second part is that the current NAC framework, at least, is undergoing reform, but just changing the methodology will not work. We have to work on the global acceptability and fixing the image of the framework. So these are the 2 areas I think which are important for us to look at. And how we could do that, I think first is that the Indian government, or this is more of a governmental thing rather than anything else. The first is that we need to have a stronger voice on the global platforms when it comes to either the INQAAE, which is the International Quality Assurance Framework, and also the Asia Pacific Quality Assurance Framework. We need to have a stronger voice there. We cannot be just part of the conversations. We have to start leading the conversations. With the 1.4 billion people, I think we need to have a stronger representation in there, just like how we've hosted, the G20, we have hosted the AI Summit. India needs to lead on that front with the conversation, because the frameworks we have created needs to start being benchmarked there. The second is that we have to work on equivalency. We have to start mapping, and I think the grade 5, which is global excellence in a new framework which NAC has, needs to start being benchmarked against the global counterparts. What would it mean? And I think TEXA in Australia is looking at certain levels which they can start to benchmark against. That needs to be moved forward. And a third, I feel, is that we need to start using common benchmarks beyond accreditations. And these could be rankings, could be ratings, could be other evaluation which are subjects as well. So accreditations for ASCSP, AMBA, the ACPE for pharmacy, and several others. So we need to start going beyond that to start benchmarking against it. So while we are battling a legacy from the past, we need to start. The only difference what we have at the moment is how we look at the future versus the past. And that difference is where the gap needs to be filled in. So my final word is that India needs to have a say on what's happening globally, and our accreditation frameworks need to be in that conversation on the global stage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashwin. Dr. Raman, if I could ask you, well, probably this is a question that a lot of my colleagues in the audience might have. What impact could this have, the entry of the IBCs? What impact do you think this could have on the faculty recruitment, retention, and compensation structures in Indian universities? Will this In your opinion, will this in any way intensify the war for talent?
Great question. The war for talent is going to become murkier, right? The latest parliament report talks about vacancies in IITs and IIMs. The total vacancy in IITs, IIM for teaching positions is about 28%. And at the professor level, it is 56% vacancy only in IITs and IIMs. In the state of Maharashtra, the vacancy is about 38%. That is the state of affairs today. Teaching is not something which is sought after by many. Walk into any institution of repute and ask how many of them aspire to become profs or assistant profs. Very less. How many of them plan to do their PhD? Very less. They have their aspirations to work for the corporate, create startups, get angel funding. This is what they are actually looking at. So point number one, people who are looking at teaching as a career itself is very less in this country. Okay? Now, once you're going to have competition coming in, there'll be people who are looking for talent, two types of talent. One, today getting good teachers who can teach, who can research, who can also do administration is very, very limited. Not all individuals have all these three talents of teaching, doing research, as well as administration. Some of them are very good in research, but very poor in teaching and very poor in administration. That said, ranking agencies like QS, Ashwini is here, are giving 60% weightage to research, wherein already many allied institutions are looking at teaching as a punishment. Sorry to tell this word. They say, I'll do research. Well, that's what is going to give me all pride. Why? I get good papers, good citations, and that's what the institution is actually looking at as well. So why should I even teach? Is what is kind of becoming a norm today, right? Which is a very serious problem for this country, especially, I would say, at the undergraduate level. Because if you don't really inspire students, and if you really do not teach, it's very difficult for the next generation to actually learn the right way. One teacher is worth about 1,000 books. So getting good people to teach is going to be a bigger problem. It's already a bigger problem. It's going to become a mammoth problem. Getting good researchers will all the more become difficult. Why? Because you'll have competing institutions who are giving compelling salaries for them to shift, right? And the movement, if you look at generally, is very high at the assistant professor level. That's the place where people shift very fast. At the associate professor, it is not so much. At the prof level, it is much more lesser. Why? Because at the assistant professor level, during the start of the career, say about 8 to 10 years, they move very fast. And that's the talent which will be very difficult to get as well. And that's the place we are going to find a lot of challenge to get good people. Now, to build institutions, to head institution, we need good people who are good administrators as well as who are good teachers. Very, very difficult. Already, it's going to become all the more difficult. But we'll have to wait and watch how all this game is going to change. Why? Because all these institutions who are coming here also have their math there of looking at their break even, because nobody is coming here for charity. All of them are coming here to make business. How many admissions are going to happen? How much time are they ready to wait for these admissions to happen in the right fashion for them to break even? Because they're also going to put in money. So we are right now at a time, at least for the next 5 to 6 years, things are going to be competitive. There are going to be a huge movement of people, especially good researchers, not even good teachers, good researchers. Because these institutions who come in also are looking at people who are good at research, and they want to take them as well. So it is going to be a war of talent, and the movement is going to be at this level. Like, if there is someone who is working in a government job in a tier 3 city in India, will not really be affected by this. This is my view. But at the tier 1 cities where these institutions are getting established, be it Bombay, be it the gift city, be it Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad. So these are the places where you have got good private institutions also. So it's going to become difficult for them to retain talent, to attract talent. Two things can happen. These institutions then will start looking at people who are the Indian diaspora who want to come back. That is another thing that's happening, that outside India, there are people who want to come back due to whatever policies that's changing across the western part of the world. So they want to come back. And when they're going to come back, now is the competition. Am I able to go and get them here? Or is this competition which is coming into India is going to attract them? So that's again something which is going to happen. You will have the influx of talent who are coming in, again at the assistant professor level. Because all those who are doing their PhD outside India will wait for the next Diwali and say, I'll come back to India. Or the next Durga Puja, after that I'll come back to India. And once 10 Durga Pujas are done, they'll park that idea. So it's only the break-even of 8 to 10 Durga Pujas or Diwalis by which they want to come back. And here is the opportunity that is there for all of them. And they'll come back. And they'll be actually the ones who will be sought after by many. And they got the bargaining power now. So the game is going to change. It's going to change for sure for the next 5 to 6 years. And then we'll have to see how the game moves post that. So answer, yes, it's going to get quote unquote murkier.
So there obviously is a need for us to re-look at our talent management policies. If I could stay with you and then ask a follow-up question about some of the larger universities today, while there is an ability to innovate and there is a sincere intention to do so, do you think our existing structures and processes in some way are a deterrent? For instance, like how a large ship takes longer to make that turn or be on a different course. Do you think there is a need for Indian universities to take a look into how they are structured and how their policies and processes are structured?
Absolutely. See, if you look at any private university in India, maximum amount of revenue comes from the student fees. When you say maximum, it is about 95% plus. So all of them are looking at the students as one of the most important source of revenue for them, right? So once that is the major source of revenue, all your policies will be based on that, because I should get good number of students. Very few universities are looking at the other source of income. Other source of income through ensuring that you are commercializing patents, which is a great source of income, which many universities are not looking at. Second, ensuring that you are taking stakes in startups and ensuring that you are promoting that startup ecosystem, which will take time. If you're creating a startup, 8 out of 10 fail, and the 2 which you will have to bet, and they have to go big, and then the return comes after 8, 9 years, 10 years only. Let me give a case example. We also have an incubator here. We have 60 plus startups there. If you ask me, are there successful startups? Yes. Quoting an example, one, for example, is EaseBus, which is one among the top 5 payment gateways in India. It's our startup. We took stakes about 3% in that. We liquidated and we got 21 crores. That's the money that we have got to put it back. Now let us assume if I'm going to have 10 such EaseBus on campus. So multiply even a simple math, 210 crores come from that. But it takes 7-8 years for me to get that. And if I'm continuously ensuring that I am investing on such kind of startups, that becomes a source of revenue for me. Once that becomes a source of revenue for me, my policies can change. How I'm going to look at inflow of money changes. So the way I'm going to spend also can change. And above all this, there are regulatory measures which I have no control on, right? So there are, you will have to look at the other sources of revenue first. Once you have got alternate sources of revenue coming in, then possibly you can say how I'm going to spend. Can I become benevolent in spending? All this will then take priority. Otherwise, students still will remain my key client, where anything and everything will be focused towards students. That should be there. But what about spending on research? That possibly will take the second step. Why? Because for me, my client is student. Anything that I do for student is what is important. The next comes other aspects which is in my priority list. So once I got alternate source of income, others can also become priority one, and I can start spending in a better fashion, then my processes will change as well.
Wonderful. In fact, for the next question, I shall stay with you, Professor Raman. Do you think Indian universities can match the financial strength of the very well-endowed and very well-capitalized foreign universities? For that matter, even the pricing power that the foreign universities have today is very different as compared to what we have in India. What alternate funding models do you think there can be for Indian universities to explore?
I think I answered that. The alternate funding is ensuring that you look at startups, take stake in startup, ensure that you're creating patents, commercializing those, grant that patent and commercialize that patent. That becomes the alternate source of income. Unless we look at these alternate sources of income and also looking at consulting an MDP, especially if you're a business school, say how you can get your money from consulting an MDP. So if these alternate sources of income becomes very strong, then yes, you can possibly see that you can possibly tackle those institutions who are coming in here. Otherwise, the endowments, let us take for example, even if Harvard is not going to charge any fee, tuition fee, for their students for the next 15 years, they can still sustain with the endowment that they have. That's enough for them to sustain, and they are able to go and take on the government, telling, I am not okay with what your policies are. Right? So many of our institutions are not having that kind of power. Right? So to get that kind of power, we should have good sources of alternate revenue streams. Could be some of them that I have listed. And if that happens, then yes, we can take on those institutions which have greater financial power. Otherwise, it will be tough.
Can I add, I feel the industry funding that we see outside is, though it's picking up in our country, if that pick up, that becomes a very, very important source of funding. And all the R&D labs that you see are mostly abroad, situated in universities. We don't see that culture here. The moment you have that R&D expenditure, etc., coming from industry, it not only solves the problem we've been talking about the last 3 days about skills and employability, but also a lot about funding. And of course, endowments, which we have now started seeing, that people are now giving back to their alma maters.
Dr. Bhavna, if I could stay with you and request you to talk about how could the increased global competition make quality education, I mean, is it making quality education less accessible or more expensive for Indian students? And how should institutions really balance the global excellence while also being socially responsible?
It's actually been a total, again, reshaping, the shift from the scarcity to the scale that we are seeing. The fact that we now have so many institutions which are, and we still don't have the gross enrollment ratio. It's not only the people who are coming in, the door has been opened. It's also about how we are stepping out. So as Symbiosis could not meet the numbers here, it's gone out. So the door is open for everybody. You can use it for somebody to come in or to go out as well. I feel that in terms of the fee, I have also seen that quality institutions are also cross-subsidizing. So it's not that they're not allowing people who don't have paying capacity to not get the education that they want, and those cross subsidies are available. Even EMIs are also becoming more available. I call it the iPhone effect. If iPhone is costing 75,000, somebody who's earning 75,000 is sometimes just aspires and gets it. Education is that aspiration which has to emerge in our country. So far, it's been, I need the education to get a degree and a job and etc. The moment the love for education becomes there, and yes, the quality teachers make it inspiring, and you feel, yes, I want to go and learn because I enjoy learning, not just because I want that piece of paper. I want to do engineering because I actually enjoy doing engineering, and after engineering, I'm not looking to becoming an investment banker or to joining a company to sell consumer goods, but I'm actually doing engineering because I want to do engineering. If that shift happens, then this scale and accessibility will automatically increase.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna. Dr. Ashwin, universities globally are moving away from the single monolith campus model towards a distributed, globalized education system. How must our evaluation models evolve to capture the value of these cross-border networks? Will we see a shift from ranking destinations to ranking systems? And how can Indian institutions position themselves to lead rather than just join these emerging global multi-campus alliances?
So currently, we are seeing that the ranking systems were designed to measure what universities were 5, 10 years back. And the monolith model of campus, which is in a single destination, a single pin code, or a single building, is changing. And I think that is where I think ranking systems need to evolve as well. And I think we are looking at the branch campus model as well. How do we incorporate the impact of it? And there are 3 areas which I think we need to look at when we're looking at the impact of how campuses today are evolving. I think Symbiosis is in Dubai, Manipal is in Malaysia, UAE, VIT is in Mauritius, and several other locations. The first is an IIT Delhi is in Abu Dhabi. So the first is, how are we going to measure as ranking agencies the impact of an IIT Abu Dhabi graduate who gets employed with a UAE employer, and how that impact is measured in rankings needs to be evaluated. And I think at the moment, when we're looking at how, like, for example, University of Wollongong has built campuses everywhere. Currently, everything is measured as a global landscape, right? We are still not able to decipher which campus is having what impact in the ranking system. So one is that the rankings need to start looking at the regional impact of the global campuses of institutions. And that's something QS has been looking at, and we hope in the near future we can be able to say, okay, even though your University of Southampton in the UK, your University of Southampton Delhi has a Y impact, whereas the campus in mainland has an A impact. So that is the first thing, is measuring the employer impact. The second is looking at how we are going to capture a graduate who started off in maybe university, let's use Symbiosis University in this case, in Pune, then does a semester in Bangalore, then decides to do something at the Symbiosis campus in Dubai, and then gets employed or does a research internship in a Dubai institution. How do we measure the cross-border impact of an institution which has multiple campuses? It doesn't involve the employer here, but it does involve several campuses, and we should be able to capture all of that. And the third is the cross-border research impact, wherein an IIT Madras campus in Zanzibar works with the University of Dar es Salaam to look at a water desalination project in mainland there. Right now, the research impact is all captured under IIT Madras, but the impact is in Tanzania, and it does involve several stakeholders there, including from Zanzibar. So the capturing of that information is where also our ranking systems need to evolve. And while at the moment it is a simplistic view of rankings, when Dr. Raman mentioned, there is, of course, research is calculated, but it's already on the path to being revolutionized. We're looking at international research networks, wherein we're looking at how many partners do you collaborate with besides your home campus. Institutions like IIT Madras needs to then start looking at how do we break off IIT Madras Zanzibar campus into a different affiliation, so that can be measured, the impact of that can be measured. At the end of all of this, I think it is an evolving situation. I want to touch upon slightly on excess, and this is of course on the evolving model, right? And I just want to add something what Dr. Raman said, and there's something worries me slightly, being an Indian and seeing the current excess of higher education. In Goa, because I'm from Goa, and that's a little bit personal thing there, we are looking at providing the underprivileged rural kids access to higher education, which nobody wants to do it. And with faculty being taken over, we are seeing international branch campuses coming in, offers for salaries are increasing. We are going to see how that's going to be highly competitive. My worry is, will the student be impacted? Because that would also mean that fees would increase, because Symbiosis would need to start retaining the best talent. If 5 campuses are coming in CITCO in Navi Mumbai, there's going to be another 5 more coming. The Maharashtra is very positive on that. And the faculty are not being flown in from foreign campuses. They are domestic faculty. The impact of that, Anupama, is probably going to be on a student. So we need to start looking at that. While trying to increase our GER, we might further deepen the access to education, higher education in the country. So this is on the personal front where I'm slightly concerned about. On the professional front, definitely evaluation frameworks need to capture what each branch campus is doing and need to justify the fees, perhaps. And then, of course, we'll then be able to compare the impact of Symbiosis in Pune. Do you have a campus in Mumbai as well? We don't have a campus, okay. So Symbiosis Pune versus a campus of IBC in Mumbai on an equal level playing field would be something to look for the future.
That's very insightful. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ashwin. If I could come to Professor Babu for the last question before I open the questions for audience. What should Indian universities stop doing in order to compete globally? Where must they choose to be distinct rather than imitate Western models?
One thing which I want to start with is what Professor Bhavna was pointing out. Even the best of our Indian universities, like the public ones in earlier, like Delhi University even, it is impossible for me, like if I'm doing economics, for me to walk into a mathematics department. In economics, we say that the math is our language. But would I be able to, take for example, Indian Statistical Institute, which is one of the finest economics PhD programs, and it also has a probability and statistics department. Some of the world's best are teaching there. But would an economics student from this, from just the same building, one room to the one classroom to the other, would they be willing to go and take those courses? Answer is no. And the same is true for most of the Indian universities. I won't be able to kind of walk into another, as an economics student, can I go into a business school and take some courses there? Certainly not. So these are like completely that siloed approach to education, and that is something we need to stop. That's a first thing. The second thing we need to do is, what is important is what I call the first principles thinking. So you are living in a world which is like, the only thing which I can think of is a industrial revolution. So that kind of a intersystemic change is happening. And if you're living in such an old world, like no one tool is going to help you. Like if you have a hammer in hand, everything will look like a nail. But that is not going to help you here. So you need to be good with everything. Like whatever is thrown at you, so you need to handle it. So on every day, like this world is like, churning some new surprises for us. And these are extremely catastrophic events with extremely small probabilities. So those are the kind of things which you are going to face. To face that, you need to be able to think from the first principles, like anything which comes at you. So like for example, like I'll just give an example, like what I mean by first principles thinking. As a graduate student, like in Indian Institute of Science, like you have oral comprehensive examinations. And I had Professor Madhav Gadgil thinking about Pune, and so he comes to my mind. So he was there as an examiner. And he kind of asked me, he started me off something on fishery. I said, I know nothing about fishery. So, but he said, it's okay, I'll help you. Please go to the board. So then he said, if I have a big pond, so you have fish, so how would you measure it? He kind of introduced the notion of biomass, and then biomass, the growth, I think that became a differential equation. Then the solution to it gave rise to something, and it went on and on like that. Of course, I was literally shivering. This is one of the most crucial examinations in a PhD student's life. So, but that exactly is the first principle. I couldn't tell Professor Madhav Gadgil, one of the country's the top mathematical biologists, I can't tell him that this is out of syllabus. No way. You have to, whatever comes at you, you have to answer. So the only way I could have done that is because of the first principles thinking, which I was fortunate enough to get in Indian Institute of Science. But what I can say is that kind of exposure doesn't happen in best of the Indian institutions. Indian Institute of Science had it at one particular time in 80s, but I'm not even sure whether that has the same culture now. Even best institutes like TFR doesn't have the same kind of a culture. So, but that is what you need to develop. And in terms of the other part of the question which you asked, with 2 or 3 experiments which we did. So one is we are used to sending our students to the foreign universities and so on and so forth, the top 10, 25 top schools in the US and so on and so forth. But then we thought, so why can't India become a training hub for the Asian countries, right? So we tried to build open our own, in IJDR we tried this experiment. We opened our own degree programs to students from all around Asia, except perhaps Pakistan because of our differences with that country. But all other countries, the students were admitted to this particular program, and they could do it instead of going like to Canada and UK and so on and so forth. So our question was like, you have the same kind of a syllabus, you have same standards. Why can't they come here? Why can't we attract it? And strangely, the Canadian government put like almost like $1 million into this particular funding this particular project, and we experimented it. And of course, we realized that the Asian students were finding it really difficult to cope with our curriculum. And in return, like we also learned certain new things. Like we, for example, saw like these students coming, getting depressed, failing out of the program, and so on and so forth. Then we were forced to innovate in terms of designing slow track programs and the ways to help these students psychologically. Because you don't want to tag like a slow track learner, right? So then you need to kind of look into the psychological effects of it. So then we were kind of forced to also innovate and all those kind of things. So in the other thing which I would, other experiment is like with the European Master's Program in Law and Economics. So this is funded by European Erasmus Plus program. And we had like Bologna, which is which is the oldest of the modern universities, 800 years old. And at that point, like we were some 25 years old. So we were the youngest kid in the thing. So we had the best of the European universities, including Haifa in Israel. So we had around a 9-university consortium, which we ran this international master's program in law and economics. And that ran for almost like, now it's like 35th, 38th year. So those kind of things, like you can experiment. Like then you can position yourself internationally in those consortium as equal partner and see like what you learn from there. Like what we learned from this particular program, EMLE program, is the importance of mobility. Mobility is not like, don't take it like an academic tourism. So this is like, it was pointed out in the earlier panel, it is about culture. So it is about picking up, like imagine like India's strategic interests in countries like Myanmar, Africa, and so on and so forth. And and if you look around for expertise within the country who have ground knowledge of those countries, we don't find it. But amongst my German students, I found that like many of them had excellent ground sense of many of the African countries. So, but that is something you need. And that is the reason, that's the importance of this mobility. And we are a big country. So like our states are much bigger than many of the European countries. So there could be mobility within India. And our Indian institutions, synergetic and complementary institutions, can come together and develop joint programs. Like for example, like sitting in Bombay, like IJDR and Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, we came together to develop, and IIT Bombay, we came together to develop mathematical finance courses. And the same thing, like you can try with, we tried with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and International Institute of Population Studies, course on development practice. Had we done it, it was in 2008, we signed an MOU and all that, but beyond that, because of the institutional egos, that did not take off. But had it had taken off, so we would have had practitioners who could have handled, like when the pandemic hit us. So we didn't have those kind of multidimensional talent within the country. So somebody who understands epidemiology, somebody who also understands the economics of it, and also the necessary field work, ability to do the field work. So that kind of a thing we would have had like by 2008-9. But like those are the kind of things I think like we can do to stand strong on our own legs, like, so that's basically what I would think.
So I think we spent about an hour on this discussion, and I think one quick reflection for all of us here. The topic of this panel is resilience to resurgence, Indian institutions in an era of global competition. And because we are looking at global competition coming in India, I think the panelists have already said, have kind of already spoken of how we have a competitive edge. I think we should stop worrying of the IBCs. We should benchmark internationally. We should start looking what Symbiosis has been doing. What is stopping, if University of Southampton comes to India, why can't India go to Southampton? India has 35 million diaspora at the moment in the world. And that's a big number. We have, and for those good institutions which are highly ranked in NRF or in QS, I will not fail to mention QS as well, have the opportunity to go out, have the opportunity to establish themselves what the foreign institutions are doing in India. We have the opportunity to do that. And I think some of them have selectively done that, but there's a bigger opportunity, especially with the Indian diaspora. And I think Indians are known around the world. They are heading some of the global top 500 companies. We have built the prestige. I think it is time for us to stop worrying of our competition, perceived competition, because I think it's already kind of concluded that we have an edge. How do we use our edge? Of course, scaling up in India, but also going abroad and establishing our presence abroad to various programs. Finally, skills. We have spoken a lot about whatever we have so far, but we have not touched on skills. And that's a major area for reskilling in India, not just skilling at the moment, because when we look at jobs currently, there are several jobs which are going to disappear. But that impact is also going to be on the people who already have jobs. Out of 600 million Indian occupations which we have mapped, are people in occupations, 100 million of them by 2030 are going to be at risk of severe risk of job loss due to AI and various other skills. I think we should be worrying of that rather than the competition, because that competition is there for a specific niche. We should be looking at how we're going to use our strengths to be able to challenge the various issues coming in the future. Sorry, I had to make this comment quickly because I know we're ending.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ashwin. Now I request the audience to ask any questions if there are.
Thank you for that insightful discussions. I would like to request Dr. Ashwin Fernandes comment on that. Should there be a separate ranking and evaluation framework design for TNA, and one that measure developmental aspects aligned with the states, the host nations and the host states, and as well as that focuses on knowledge exchange and local engagement rather than the traditional metrics.
Thank you so much. Could you introduce yourself as well, please?
Yeah. This is Wali Rahman Rahmani from Afghanistan, research scholar at Symbiosis International.
Perfect, Wali. So I think that's a fantastic question. And we need, as I said, the ranking frameworks need to start measuring the impact of the transnational education, especially with research and student outcomes as well. I feel this is an area of perhaps in India, as IBCs are coming in, I think NIRF has to take on that responsibility to measure the impact of the branch campuses in India, probably with supporting the knowledge, supporting the community, supporting the state. What are they going to do? Because at the end of the day, we want them to be successful because we have a huge gap in the GR, and we have, if we want to be developed nation by 2047, I think that is the IBCs are going to support us. Again, I'm being explicit that the IBCs are going to serve a niche area, not everybody. So definitely, I think on a global scale, none of the students are looking at, can I look at a ranking of IBCs and look at what is the impact of the IBCs in a particular state. So I think this is more of a state or a national initiative to be done.
Since the topic is about Indian institutions in a global competition era, we have been hearing that one of the key factors that could improve internationalization scores across Indian universities, particularly in rankings such as QS, is the introduction of some post-study work rights for international students in the country. We have seen in our own neighborhood in Nepal, for example, they are introducing a multi-year, multi-5-year visa under the new government as part of a wide range of education reforms. What do you think is stopping India from implementing a similar initiative which focuses on post-study work rights or on multi-year visas? And how are you as institutions and organizations kind of working to encourage this through the government as well?
I think a bureaucrat can possibly answer that. But in my view, we already have a problem of unemployment in India. If you look at the stats of how many people who are graduates who are unemployed, each year the data comes up definitely above 50%. So that's one reason possibly when I'm not able to give employment to people who are graduates from my own country, how will I go ahead and create a rule that others who are studying here will work here? Could be the reason. I'm just giving a random guess. I do not know. But as institutions where we attract foreign students here, we are in every forum are trying to tell the government that there should be some kind of rule wherein it will encourage those students from specific set of universities at least who will have to be given some opportunity to work possibly for a couple of years, and that will help attract Indian universities larger number of students from other countries. That negotiation is on, but we do not know when that will become a policy for it to be implemented. That is the only answer that I have.
Hello, my name is Omkar. I work with the Symbiosis International Office, and I have this question for Dr. Raman. What would you say about the adaptation of AI, particularly in research, specifically because, as Dr. Verghese has pointed out, that we lack in research, and with the LLMs like Claude and GPT, with each passing day, they are advancing when it comes specifically to research. So I would like to know your thoughts on how that can be, what's your thoughts on how it can be adapted in the research part? And this question is not drafted on AI.
I mean, I'm not still very clear how LLMs...
How the LLMs, like what role would that be, how they will be adapted by researchers, in doing the research, like what's your views on that?
Yeah, there are several tools which can be helping researchers to do research faster. Let us take, for example, there is a site called Connected Papers, which can help me find out in any specific topic which are the most cited papers and how is my research topic connected, who are the great influencers in this area, who have done seminal work in this area. For example, it used to take so much time for me to get into a library and find it, but this tool can help me easily find out. So if you look at research and AI, it can help researchers to do effective research in a faster manner. But the problem here is these AI tools are also helping people to bypass and do things faster. That's the problem that we have today, that these AI tools, if not used properly, will also create problems. Like for example, for every journal that you send, there is a specific format in which the references have to be made. This is a big, strenuous task. You got an APA style, you got an IEEE style, you got a Harvard style. Now with an AI, you can do this entire referencing very fast. Just give all, and you can ask, I want all of these references in this style. Within possibly 30 seconds, all of them is done, which otherwise used to take possibly 2.5 hours. So wherever we are able to go and use these tools for us to make things faster is the place where researchers can use. But it's a double-edged sword today. In fact, to that extent, Turnitin has told anything about 20% is okay because they are not able to ensure that whatever is being detected as AI, is it really AI or is it not? We are at that juncture now. So that being the case, we'll have to wait and watch how tools evolve to exactly find out if things are really AI generated for it to be ethically used. But anyway, I've answered. That's not related to the panel here. I request if there is any more, otherwise we can conclude.
Due to paucity of time, I think we will not take any more questions, but I'm sure there are many conversations that you wish to have. Let's continue these conversations over lunch. If I could quickly, very, very quickly summarize what insights have emerged out of this discussion, that opening of India's higher education sector is a structural shift that demands a strategic clarity, institutional agility, and a strong sense of purpose. With this, I would like to thank the esteemed panelists and all of you for being such engaged and wonderful audience. We hope that discussion has sparked new ideas, perspectives, as we collectively shape the next chapter of Indian higher education. Thank you. Over to the MCs.
Thank you so much for such an engaging discussion. It's especially fitting that you frame endurance not as this passive state of waiting and battening down our hatches while we ride out the storm, but as a phase of active transition where institutions ought to become richer and more diverse entities. Right? Thank you so much. May I please invite Lieutenant General Dr. M.A. Tutakne to felicitate the panelists.
I think on behalf of the panelists, we would like to thank first is Dr. Vidya for organizing this conference here, and also to the conference chair, Dr. Neeta Inamdar. I think, thank you so much. I think there's a lot of work going on, and I think you kept so many people still in the room at this, on the last day of the conference. We'd like to thank you, please. A round of applause, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again for your engagement with IHE 2026.